So, in our first video on Matins, which starts the sun shines, we talked about our speaker and who that person is and how they're experiencing the world around them and the natural world, and kind of that contrast that's established. And in that one, we didn't necessarily have our poet speaker looking at or addressing a particular audience. That changes in our next poem. So, this is our next Matins poem. And this one starts, "What is my heart to you?" And so this is the one that we are going to be looking at now. It's on page 15 in your lovely little poetry book. So this is the next Matins poem that we are going to look at together. And so again, as a reminder, this is our morning prayer. It's a little bit different from our initial morning prayer that we considered in the last video. Again, we know that when we have these Matins poems, our speaker is going to be our poet gardener. And in this one, our audience is stated. We can see that in this very first line, right? What is my heart to you? So we know that there is this direct address, and that you, we know through our study of the rest of these poems and through our understanding of this like poetry cycle, that you is God, or God with a lowercase, or just some sort of like deity or larger force, right? And so in this poem, we have our poet gardener, our speaker, addressing that deity directly, unlike in the first one that we looked at. Um, and the tone is a little bit different, right? We have our initial poem that was kind of about this description of nature and the natural world and how to experience it. This one uses the natural world, but as a way to convey their own feelings, which we did get a little bit of in our first Matins as well. So as we get into it, it says, "What is my heart to you that you must break it over and over like a plantsman testing his new species?" And so we have that simile there that is comparing our audience, our deity, our God, to a plantsman, and comparing her to like the species of, that this plantsman or that this gardener is themselves testing. And so we also then have this kind of command that happens here by our speaker. The speaker says, "Practice on something else." And so basically is saying like, "Leave me alone. Please don't do this to me." And goes on to say, "How can I live in colonies as you prefer if you impose a quarantine of affliction, dividing me from healthy members of my own tribe?" So we have that contrast here being established between isolation and society. And our speaker is saying here basically that like I can't live with other people. I can't live in colonies, which is how you are asking me to live. If you are imposing a quarantine of affliction and dividing me from healthy members of my own tribe. And so that idea, like that the speaker is being divided from healthy members of her own tribe, implies some sort of like sickness that is happening there. And she compares what is happening to her. And here we're not necessarily talking about like literal. This is not like a literal sickness necessarily. This is all kind of metaphorical. But she says, you do not do this in the garden, segregate the sick rose, right? So she's saying like, if I'm the sick rose, like, and I was a sick rose in your actual literal garden, you would not segregate me. She says, you let it wave its sociable infested leaves in the faces of the other roses. So again, we have this imagery of the garden and flowers and everything like that. And this is being used to to illustrate her point about how the speaker, this God, is treating her, or what she's being subjected to by this speaker, this God. It's a super interesting description, right? Especially when you see like these two words up against each other, this juxtaposition, the sociable infested leaves. And so this infestation, again, are these like tiny aphids, which are basically tiny little bugs that are destructive to plants, right? She says the tiny aphids leap from plant to plant, proving yet again, I am the lowest of your creatures, following the thriving aphid and trailing rows, right? So she's saying like, hey, you let the aphids, basically run amok in the garden. You let them do whatever they want to do. You let the sick rose do whatever it wants to do. Because I am being subjected to all of these terrible things, I'm being subjected to this isolation. You're showing me that I'm the lowest of your creature. And then we have again this direct address, Father, which makes us, of course, think that we are thinking about like a Christian God with an uppercase G. She says, Father, as agent of my solitude, alleviate at least my guilt. And so again, when she talks about like him as, or the speaker, or excuse me, the audience is the agent of her solitude, she is basically saying like, if you are the agent of something, you're causing it. So she's saying this isolation, this solitude is because of this God in some way. They are, afflicting her or causing her to have something, causing her to have some sort of, sickness or illness, again, with that idea of quarantine too. That is separating her from everybody else, right? She says, lift the stigma of isolation. We do have a shift here, right? Because we have that unless. So we have that shift. She says, like, let me out of this isolation unless it is your plan to make me sound forever again, as I was sound and whole. When we are talking here about this idea of being sound, we're not talking about like a sound that you would hear, right? If you are sound and whole, it basically means that you are, that you're well, right? You are in sound health. And so it goes again with this, that you're healthy. It goes with this like complex of connotative language and complex of images about like illness and wellness that's happening here. So in the shift, she's saying, like, let me be with people, lift the stigma of isolation, unless it's your plan to make me sound and whole as I was in my childhood, or if not, then under the light weight of my mother's heart, or if not, then in dream. So, what is happening down here, right? What is this shift telling us? What we see basically is the speaker saying like, hey, I need company, I need to be with other people, I need you to lift, like she says, the stigma of isolation, unless you're using this to make me better, unless you are using that to make me sound and whole. And she compares places where she felt sound and whole previously, right? So those places where she felt sound and whole, number one is her mistaken childhood. So that doesn't sound great, or realistic. Or if not, then under the light weight of my mother's heart. And this can also be kind of read, right? Like, first of all, as like the light weight of my mother's heart, the idea of like sound and whole as she was, in the way that how her mother perceived her. But the image that she's providing to us there is not just like, oh, like it's not just she's sound and whole, as her mother sees her. The way that it's presented, this idea of under the light weight of my mother's heart, like that to me reads as almost like this idea of like when she was like in her mother's womb, because of the way that that's set up, under the weight of the light weight of her mother's heart. So again, can she really go back there? No. And then third is, if not then, in dream, first being that would never die. So she's saying, oh, this is when I would be, so this is the other place that I feel like I have been sound and whole before, in my childhood, in my mother's womb, or in dreams. And so none of these are realistic, right? So she's basically saying like, hey, let me go back to like rejoining colonies. Let me go back to like being a part of something. Let me, take this away from me unless you are planning to make me well and whole and healthy again. Like I was in my childhood, like I was in my mother's womb, or like I am in dreams. And so basically she's saying like, I know that you can't make me sound and whole, right? We can't go back to these places of like quote unquote perfection. And so she's kind of calling out the deity, like, hey, unless you're going to take me back here where things were perfect, like this unrealistic perfection, then you need to not divide me from my people, or from my colonies, or from my from my people, from the people that I love. And so in some ways, she is, first of all, asking, like she's questioning God, right? Like what is the point of her isolation and suffering? She says, is the point to make me well and healthy like I was here? I don't think that that is helpful. I don't think that that is realistic. I don't think that that's going to happen, right? So she's saying like, because of this like lack of realistic, kind of health, quote unquote, that I can go back to, she's like, you need to just let me, um, you know, not feel so separated from my community. So again, this is interesting because it is framed as this prayer, but it feels pretty like accusatory. It feels like there is a lot of like commands given to God, which of course is that idea of irony. And then we also are using, of course, the main images and the main kind of things that we're working with here for language, of course, is like the imagery of the rose and the aphids, and then also the language of basically illness and wellness to convey all of this.